Hello everyone, and welcome to Leading Through Example, exploring equity, diversity, and inclusion in the library workplace. My name is Franco Vitell, part of Team F of the 2020-21 ALA Emerging Leaders cohort. I'm opening this presentation, and you'll hear from the rest of our group, including Victoria Blackmer, Teresa, Helena Moreno, Jodi Silverman, and Desmond Wong, later in this video. Our team supported Phase 2 of the Learning Roundtable's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Staff Development project. We were tasked with using the work of 2019's Emerging Leaders cohort to develop an EDI database. We inherited an Excel spreadsheet which listed EDI resources and was accessible through the Learning Roundtable's ALA Connect space, which you can see here. Our goal was to produce a final product of a database intended for web publication. Coming out of our initial meeting at the ALA Midwinter meetings in Philadelphia in January 2020, our group was set on finding ways to develop the resource list into a database. However, we were aware of an already existing ALA resource, the EDI Speakers Bureau. For the most part, our project would potentially duplicate the already existing resource. We then surveyed a list of attendees from the 2019 poster session to get their opinion on how they would prefer to access EDI resources. We found that 89% had not accessed the spreadsheet at all or didn't know where to find it. All those that did access the spreadsheet had not utilized a single resource from the list, and 78% preferred a searchable database over a spreadsheet. With this in mind, we began to think about how best to deliver a final product, and then the COVID-19 pandemic struck.
Because of the need to pivot our project and its outcomes due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the pause of in-person events, we considered how we might make an impact in this new landscape. Through conversations, we realized that there were many opportunities to address the continued inequality that was made worse by the pandemic. As we considered how we might best serve marginalized patrons through the library, we discussed what spaces there were for us to have a frank conversation about how we were approaching service models, the ethics of community service, and communication in our libraries. In addition to this, we were and remain acutely aware that as libraries begin to reopen alongside the rest of the country, how these inequalities that had been exposed would not simply disappear, but rather would require deep critical reflection to determine the root causes. In response to this conversation, we determined that we wanted to open a space for dialogue amongst our emerging leader colleagues and how we might collectively think about and envision a post-pandemic library together. We were inspired by conversations around liberatory practices in libraries, especially with an eye to the events that were unfolding around us. These included the Black Lives Matter movement, Stop AAPI Hate, and continued calls for Indigenous sovereignty. Taken together, we wanted to lead a discussion about how our libraries could not only recognize liberation, but actively participate in it too.
Our first step was to approach the Learning Roundtable board during midwinter 2021 and present our concerns and ideas. The board was understanding and fully supportive of our redirection towards EDI leadership training. With Learning Roundtable support, we then approached Beatrice and Pauline during the midwinter Emerging Leaders meeting to request ALA Emerging Leaders approval. They too supported our project pivot and contributed their own ideas as to how to create meaningful connections with our colleagues. Our next step was to discuss the ideas presented and narrow down our scope. We had a variety of ideas to choose from, including a clearinghouse of diversity speakers, ALA-hosted Moodle training courses, and peer-led discussion groups. After an earnest discussion of what we could achieve in the time frame ahead, we chose what we felt was a realistic goal: a peer-led discussion on the role of EDI in a leadership position. From there, our cohort met on a bi-weekly basis over the following months to refine our project, and on May 6th, we hosted the Learning Through Leadership discussion. We designed this discussion to have 2 tracks from which participants could choose from. The 2 tracks are called Revolutionary Futures for Library Workers and Leading Through Language.
So in our pivot to identifying DEI-related programming, we ended up identifying the need for us as a collective to have conversations about racism and white supremacy and how it's impacting our field. And so this led us to the conversations that happened in Breakout Group number 1. And we decided to theme our conversations on this idea of revolutionary futures for library workers. And in order for us to facilitate that and to have those conversations, we coalesced our conversations around this article that is titled Dreaming Revolutionary Futures, Critical Racist Centrality to Ending White Supremacy by author Sofia Leong and Jorge Lopez McKnight. And what we did was we asked folks to come to the conversation having at least read or skimmed parts of this article. And we decided to have conversations about the idea of ending white supremacy and revolutionary futures that the article sort of asks us to imagine. And the conversation was led by three emerging leaders, Desmond Wong, Franco Vitell, and myself, Teresa Helena Moreno. And to facilitate this, we decided to actually pull the very specific questions that the authors of the article ask us to think about. And these are the two kind of groups of questions that we really focused on. The first being this idea of progress. How is it that we're defining progress? Who gets to determine if we are progressing or not? And then we ended on this very, very big question about white supremacy and what would it sort of look like if we as a field understood the ways in which white supremacy and racist foundations were the underpinning of libraries as an institution. And we had a really great conversation. We talked about very specific things that we see happening in our libraries. We talked about how these questions sort of impact our experiences in the field. And we were able to get to the point of having hard conversations in spaces that we don't always get to have them in. So a lot of the people left feeling very fulfilled with being able to have the space to have the conversations.
Leading Through Language presentation's focus was promoting bias-free communication in the library. In this discussion, we examined how biases pervade communication in unintentional ways and explored best practices to create a bias-free discourse inside and outside of the library space. After brief introductions, the discussion began by defining cultural humility and identifying examples of it. We define bias as the tendency to value one thing over another. When reflecting on bias-free language, we acknowledge that everyone is biased. We acquire biases through socialization, our upbringing, media, and education. Subconsciously, we hold assumptions that construct barriers for our good intentions. Uncovering and overcoming our unconscious biases is not impossible. Through self-evaluation and conscious effort, we can eliminate our negative reactions and challenge our preconceived fears to empower others while conquering our closed-mindedness. We asked attendees to attempt to identify their own biases. Through acknowledgement and recognition, one can accept the benefits of eliminating unconscious bias and take steps to ease their existence. We asked attendees to consider how their biases are reflected in their language and actions. Because through conscious and deliberate use of language, one can reject biased words from becoming accepted norms by not allowing them to filter into the subconscious. As leaders, it is our responsibility to give adequate thought to the major and subtle language we use on a day-to-day basis. Language that we say and use without thinking has the capability of reinforcing unconscious, biased behavior. We asked attendees how they can inspire staff to support and expand bias-free initiatives beyond their own sphere.
As we wrap up this incredible journey, I would like to share some of our final thoughts for future emerging leaders. From our experience, we recommend to continue promoting open discussions based on these sensitive topics. As emerging leaders, you can encourage workplace policies that prohibit microaggressions and best supports diverse library space in a more equitable manner that is inclusive by design. We found that by leading by example allows people to open up and share their implicit and culturally constructed biases. These discussions are vital to actively work to overcome biases and help them build a stronger library space and community. Though the conversations may feel uncomfortable, it is encouraging that cultural humility heightens our critical consciousness and connects us one another with empathy. As we have learned from this past year, pivoting from norms has allowed us to a space that becomes more equitable, diverse, and inclusive. We should not end here, but must continue as emerging leaders to lead the conversation.